At 4:30 in the morning, my husband walked through the front door, looked at me holding our 2-month-old son, and asked for a divorce. No fight. No explanation. Just one word like our entire life together meant nothing. What he didn't know was that while everyone thought I was just the quiet wife keeping the family together, I had been paying attention to the late nights, the missing money, the lies that didn't quite add up. So when I walked out of that house carrying my baby and one suitcase before sunrise, they thought I was leaving with nothing. They were wrong. 4:30 a.m. The front door clicked open. I was standing barefoot on the cold kitchen tile, one hand stirring a pan of eggs, the other cradling my 2-month-old son against my chest. He'd finally fallen asleep after hours of soft crying. His tiny fingers curled into the fabric of my shirt like he was afraid I might disappear. The house smelled like coffee and butter, like routine, like everything I had been holding together by myself. My husband walked in without looking at me, his jacket still on, his eyes tired, but not the kind of tired that comes from work, the kind that comes from somewhere else. He loosened his tie, glanced at the table I had set for his parents, his sister, the whole family that would be awake in less than 2 hours. And then he said it. Divorce. Just like that. No explanation. No hesitation. Not even anger. Just a word dropped into the room like it meant nothing. I didn't answer. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I simply tightened my hold on my baby, turned off the stove, and stood there for a moment longer than necessary, letting the silence settle between us. Then I moved. I walked past him without a word, went into the bedroom, and pulled out a suitcase from the closet. The same suitcase I had used when I moved into this house 3 years ago, believing I was building a life. I packed slowly. A few clothes, diapers, bottles, the essentials. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me the most. When I came back into the hallway, he was leaning against the kitchen counter scrolling through his phone like nothing had happened. "Where are you going?" he asked almost casually. I looked at him for the first time since he walked in. Out. And then I opened the door and left. The sky was still dark, just beginning to fade into that quiet blue before sunrise. The world felt suspended, like it hadn't caught up to what had just happened inside that house. I strapped my son into his car seat, slid into the driver's seat, and sat there for a moment. No plan, no destination, just a strange, steady clarity. They thought I was leaving with nothing. They were wrong. My name is Emily, and until that morning, I believed I was doing everything right. I believed in patience, in keeping the peace, in showing up for my family even when it felt like no one was showing up for me. When I married Mark, he wasn't like this. He was attentive, responsible, the kind of man who opened doors and asked how my day was. We built something that felt solid. At least that's what I thought. But things changed. Slowly, quietly. It started after we moved into his parents' house temporarily. Just for a few months, he had said, while we finalized paperwork on our own place. Those few months turned into a year. Then another. By the time I got pregnant, I had already become part of the rhythm of that household. I woke up early, cooked breakfast, cleaned, helped his mother with errands, hosted family dinners, smiled through comments that were always just polite enough not to be called rude. "You're so lucky Mark works so hard. It's good you're home. You can take care of things. Family comes first, sweetheart." I told myself it was normal, that this was what marriage looked like. Mark worked late more often. He stopped asking about my day, stopped noticing the small things, stopped noticing me. When our son was born, I thought things might shift. They didn't. If anything, the gap grew wider. Sleepless nights became my responsibility. Feeding schedules, doctor appointments, endless laundry. It all fell on me. And still every morning I made breakfast for everyone. Because that's what I had always done. Because no one else would. There were signs, of course. Late nights that didn't make sense. Phone calls he took outside. A growing distance I couldn't quite name. But I ignored them. Not because I didn't see them. Because I didn't want to break what little stability I thought we still had. That morning at 4:30 a.m., he broke it for me. I drove without thinking, the quiet hum of the road filling the car as my son slept behind me. The first light of day stretched across the horizon. Soft and indifferent. I wasn't crying. I wasn't panicking. I was remembering. Every moment I had made myself smaller. Every time I had chosen silence. Every piece of myself I had slowly set aside to keep everything else intact. And for the first time in a long time, I asked myself a simple question. What do I do now? The answer didn't come right away. But something else did. A realization. I wasn't as powerless as they thought. I wasn't as unaware as they assumed. And I wasn't leaving empty-handed. I glanced in the rearview mirror at my son. Peaceful. Unaware of the world he had just been carried out of. I've got you, I whispered. But deep down I knew. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about what came next. And they had no idea what I was capable of. I didn't go far. Just across town to a small quiet neighborhood where the houses were older, and the trees had been there longer than anyone could remember. I parked in front of a pale blue home with a narrow porch and a wind chime that rang softly in the early morning breeze. Mrs. Henderson's house. She had been my neighbor before I got married. Back when I still lived in my tiny one-bedroom apartment and believed life would expand, not narrow. She was retired, widowed, and sharper than anyone gave her credit for. The kind of woman who noticed everything but only spoke when it mattered. When she opened the door and saw me standing there with a baby, a suitcase, and eyes that had clearly not slept, she didn't ask questions. She simply stepped aside and said, "Comment, Emily?" That was the first kindness I allowed myself to feel in a long time. By mid-morning, my son was fed and asleep again, curled into a borrowed bassinet near the window. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting soft patterns across his face. For a moment, everything looked peaceful. But peace has a way of bringing clarity. And clarity brings truth. Mrs. Henderson set a cup of coffee in front of me and sat across the table, folding her hands like she was waiting for me to begin. So I did. Not with tears. Not with anger. Just facts. He came home at 4:30, I said. Said divorce. That was it. She nodded once, as if confirming something she had already suspected. And you left, she added. Yes. Another nod. Good. That surprised me. You don't think I should have stayed? Tried to talk? No, she said firmly, though her voice stayed gentle. Men who speak that way aren't starting conversations, Emily. They're ending them. I sat with that for a moment. It felt accurate. The truth is, I had been preparing for something like this. Not consciously. Not in a way I would have admitted out loud. But in small quiet decisions over time. I used to handle bookkeeping before I got married. Nothing glamorous. But enough to understand how money moves. How numbers tell stories people try to hide. When Mark started coming home later. When expenses stopped adding up the way they used to. When his explanations became shorter and less convincing. I noticed. I didn't confront him. I observed. And I kept copies. Bank statements. Property documents. Insurance records. Nothing stolen. Nothing illegal. Just things I had access to as his wife. Things I chose not to ignore. At first I told myself it was just for peace of mind. Then it became something else. A quiet safeguard. I need to call a lawyer, I said finally. Mrs. Henderson didn't hesitate. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a small notepad. I know someone, she said. Used to handle my husband's estate years ago. Fair. Doesn't play games. She wrote down a name and number and slid it across the table. I looked at it for a long moment. This was the point where things became real. Legal. Irreversible. Emily, she added softly. You don't have to destroy anyone. But you do have to protect yourself. I nodded. That distinction mattered. The call was scheduled for that afternoon. In the hours leading up to it, I sat by the window watching my son sleep, replaying the last 2 years in my mind not through emotion, but through pattern. What I had missed. What I had chosen not to see. Mark had always been good with appearances. Responsible. Reliable. The kind of man people trusted without question. But behind that, things were shifting. Accounts that didn't quite match his salary. Contributions to the house that he had always framed as his. But they weren't. Not entirely. When we first moved in, I had used a portion of a small inheritance from my father to help cover renovations. It wasn't something I talked about much. Mark had insisted it was temporary, that we'd even things out later. We never did. And somehow over time, the narrative changed. The house became his. The effort became his. The story became his. But numbers don't forget. And I hadn't either. The lawyer's office was quiet. Understated. No polished marble or intimidating decor. Just bookshelves, soft lighting, and a man in his late 60s who greeted me with a steady handshake and direct eye contact. "Emily," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "Tell me what's going on." So I did. Again, no dramatics. Just facts. When I finished, he leaned back slightly, considering. "And you have documentation?" he asked. "Yes." I handed over the folder I had brought with me. "Copies only. Originals safe." He flipped through them slowly, methodically. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was evaluative. Finally, he closed the folder and looked at me. "You're not in a weak position," he said. Something in my chest shifted. Not relief. Not yet. But recognition. "All of this," he continued, tapping the folder lightly, "tells a very different story than the one your husband is likely expecting to present." I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "What do I do?" I asked. He didn't rush the answer. "We proceed carefully," he said. "We file for custody. We initiate financial discovery. And most importantly, we don't underestimate him." A pause. "Because he's already underestimated you." That night back at Mrs. Henderson's house, I sat in the quiet living room, my son asleep beside me, the weight of the day settling in. For the first time since I walked out that door, I allowed myself to feel something close to steadiness. Not because things were resolved, but because they were finally in motion. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was deciding. And that made all the difference. I looked down at my son, gently brushing a finger across his cheek. "We're going to be okay," I whispered. And this time, I believed it. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for someone else to change. I was already moving forward. The paperwork began quietly. No dramatic confrontations. No slam doors. Just signatures, filings, and a series of measured steps that would slowly reshape everything Mark thought he controlled. 3 days after I left, my lawyer filed for temporary custody. By the end of the week, we initiated financial discovery. And by the second week, Mark finally called. I didn't answer the first time. Or the second. On the third, I let it ring for a moment longer than necessary. Then picked up. "Emily." His voice was tight. Controlled. But beneath it, something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. Yes. A pause. "Where are you?" "Safe." Another pause. Longer this time. "You can't just take my son and disappear." I closed my eyes briefly, steadying myself. "He's not just your son," I said calmly. Silence. Then a shift in tone. Sharper now. "What is this? Some kind of punishment?" "No. Iraplia. It's a response." He exhaled sharply like he was trying to regain footing. "Look, whatever this is, we can figure it out. You don't need lawyers involved. They already are." That landed. I could hear it in the way his breathing changed. In the way his next words came slower, more deliberate. "You're overreacting." I almost smiled. Because that word, overreacting, had followed me for years. Every concern dismissed. Every question softened into doubt. Every instinct I had minimized. Not anymore. "No," I said quietly. "I'm responden epro uprietli." And then I ended the call.